Yeah, let's start off discussing a bit of the development of the vehicles. So one thing that's really interesting when it comes to developing vehicles for Mars is because I've mentioned this on other gameplay streams and AMAs before, is that because there's only a third gravity, it means the concept of strength to weight ratios of materials is almost alien to us. Like if you imagine on Earth, we think of steel as being strong but quite heavy. So if you build a structure too big, the weight of the structure itself will overload the reinforcements you use to build the structure. Um, Whereas on Mars, it's it's a totally different paradigm. I mean, a good example is I'm sure you've heard sayings like a spider's web is stronger than steel. And that's just referring to the strength to weight ratio of the same weight of steel in a spider's web. But when you're working in an environment like Mars, where you have one third gravity, that also means in many applications, not all of them, that effectively materials are three times stronger because they don't have to support nearly as much of their own weight. This doesn't apply to everything though, because they're not three times less massive, they're just three times less heavy. So stuff like braking, accelerating, those kinds of things that still take the same amount of pressures because that's about um, mass and acceleration, which stays constant. However, they're like the weight that needs to be supported by the wheels and suspension system and the structures, that is way lighter, which leads to the design direction we went with our vehicles, which is they are way bigger. Because if you think on Earth, like a big reason why it's very difficult to build massive machines is that they're so heavy, the ground itself cannot support them. I mean, if you look at really large tractors and backhoes and like construction digging machines, you'll notice the base footprint of the machine, like almost 50% of the footprint is just designed in massive, super wide tracks so that the vehicle itself doesn't sink into the ground. Because once you're dealing with weights of that amount, even solid environments can appear almost like liquid or quicksand. Um, so because of that, we got to build a lot bigger, and we got to look at making vehicles a lot more of a almost like a building, a self-sustaining structure. So you would have pressure inside, you would have life support inside, you would have um, inventory space, and storage space, and ability to transport people, and just a lot more functionality than we would typically see in vehicles on Earth. Like it's more looking at larger scale, say military transport vehicles and stuff. Or a great example would be like the Mercedes-Benz Unimog, which is like a vehicle that can transport people, that can transport equipment. It has like water, fuel. Like you can take 10 people, stick them in that, and they'll cross a desert, and they will have everything they need to survive crossing the desert two or three times, probably. So going much more in that design direction. And that's what we see with this first vehicle.
But Nick, there's also a challenge. Like you're making structures more massive, but then you are lengthening the shoulder, of suspension structures, and then again the amplitude of moving is completely different from what we have then on Earth. So how do you and your design team goes about those things? Because we talked a lot, that you're primarily designing a working design, like it has to work in real
Mhm.
life. Yeah. So how do you go about those challenges? Extending the
So
range.
we're really grateful that in the modern technology era, it's so easy to access uh, decent material simulations. Flawless material simulations, that's stuff that NASA and Formula One and automakers are using. But generally, good material simulations are quite anyone can get them just on CAD or even free CAD-like softwares. Uh, so what we do is we first set as if we were designing a real vehicle. We have a design brief of what the vehicle needs to do. For example, the Terrapin is designed to transport this very heavy radar structure, designed to be very agile off-road, because the idea is that you'll be exploring areas you haven't explored yet. So you need very long suspension travel, large wheelbases, and the ability to climb over a lot of structures and rock formations and stuff like that, while at the same time balancing a decent speed. Because as an exploration vehicle, you want to be able to move fairly quickly, because if you get into a situation you don't want to be in, you want to be able to get out of it quite quickly as well. So with that, we looked at what would be the requirements for the suspension system. The first thing that you'll notice is huge wheels, because although there is a third gravity, the vehicle is still quite massive and is still quite heavy. Well, massive actually is the correct word. So we want to spread out the wheelbase as much as possible. We're also looking at using semi-rigid tires, which is something that NASA right now is looking into, using metal weaves instead of like pressurized air tires, and mixing that concept with the low inflation tires that the US military tested in Antarctica, which is basically if you take a really big tire and pretty much deflate it almost completely, the contact patch of the tire is massive, which means that you can drive over stuff that normal wheels would get stuck in. You can also climb up extremely steep gradients. You can climb right over rocks and all sorts of things like that, because if you imagine a large gap in the ground, if you have a super deflated tire, then as it rolls over, your excess rubber or surface material will fill that gap and maintain traction at all times. So this is very unlike modern car tires, which are very rigid. And the downside of this is less fuel efficiency, because it costs more energy because you're constantly deforming the tire. However, with metal lattice structures to use the wheels, they can still maintain quite a good lifespan. The reason why the US military tossed out the concept originally in the 50s or 60s is because if you use a rubber tire, it deforms so much that the tires just break down really quickly. So like it's not worth it. But with new using like advanced spring steel alloys, they can return to their natural shape so easily that it becomes viable. So the first step was that really big wheels using soft compliant tires. The next element is we needed stages of suspension dampening. This is actually a great image we looked at here. The actually, let's go back a couple of images to no forwards. Yeah, that one. Stop. That image right here. So notice there's two tiers, if you will, of suspension. Actually, there's three. In normal cars, we have two tiers of suspension. The first one is the wheel itself, because the air in the wheel provides some cushioning. And here we have the same thing. The tire itself, as a compliant tire, provides a level of suspension. The next level of suspension is also built into the steering system. Notice the attachment from the wheel onto this arm is done with 4 hydraulic posts and then the drive axle. And those 4 posts can not only be used to turn the wheel left and right, but can also act as an active suspension dampening for the wheel going up and down. So instead of a spring, it's using sensors and hydraulics to actively dampen any bumps needed, or even to raise and lower the wheel where necessary. But this is at a very fine level of adjustment. And then for larger adjustments, you have the entire arm itself, whereas in the top left of the arm, you see that radial coupling, which connects to the vehicle. And then underneath that, you see a much larger hydraulic piston, and that raises and lowers the entire arm, which is for far larger suspension adjustment. So for example, if like you drive off a cliff, that the impact force from that will be far too great to absorb from the wheel mounting alone. So a majority of that would be absorbed by the whole arm. However, if you're driving across mostly flat land and you go over small bumps, that's the kind of thing that would be absorbed by the tire and the wheel coupling itself. And we can see this a bit when we get in game. Why don't you show a bit of the driving footage from in game?
Yeah, sure. Going for this?
Yes, I sent you 2 videos. You have another video that's in like a test environment.
Yeah. So that's all the production.
Let's put that one, because that's a bit easier to examine what I'm showing right now. So this is the vehicle in the suspension test environment. You can see we're also flipping through the different rarity skins. But if you'll notice, as we go over obstacles, for the smaller changes, the wheel itself raises and lowers a bit. But as the amount of raising and lowering increases past a point, that's when the whole arm itself will begin raising and lowering. So, and this is meant as like a very extreme example of testing. And here's where I drove off the side of the cliff. So yeah, my bad. I'm not a great driver, and you see some elements of that physics simulation are a bit weird, and we're still working on that because, as I said, mass and 1/3 gravity is not something that we experience a lot in games. So finding the right balance between fun and realistic gravity takes a lot of tweaking. For example, one thing we noticed in the very beginning when we first put the vehicle using realistic mass calculations, realistic torque and thrust calculations, and realistic gravity calculations, is that if you get to full speed and you hit a bump, you just go flying through the air, and like there isn't enough gravity to bring you back down to the surface to easily control the vehicle. So because of that, like we're probably looking at going closer to like half Earth gravity just to make sure the vehicles are still controllable and enjoyable to drive. And so here you'll see a bit of how the suspension arm itself absorbs larger movements and the wheel itself and the wheels absorb smaller movements. And this is, I think, for anyone wondering, this is the legendary Caripen skin, which I'm quite a fan of.
I'm just mesmerized, by all these in-game footages, and yeah, as I mentioned to you, Nick, I use this to calm my son down when he's kind of hyped and is like, "Daddy, show me something interesting." It just just throw Caripen GPRV, video, and he's calm. He's in there,
It is super mesmerizing.
Yeah, it is. Talking about the design. So we see this little dome at the back of Caripen. So we see in the blueprints. This is the place where the actual radar is being put.
Yep.
Yeah, how does it work? Because again, ground penetrating.
So the way it works is, the dome protrudes out the top and out the bottom. And what it is, the bottom part of the dome uses radar waves to detect differences in material density on the ground and environment below it. And then it will look at those densities and compare it against known minerals and what it would expect to find. And it will give you a heads-up display where you're more likely to find, for example, an iron deposit or maybe uranium inside some specific rocks, stuff like that. Obviously, there is a bit of mix of sci-fi and fantasy here. Well, I guess sci-fi, science, and fiction in how we design this, because we want something that is realistically based, but also something that is quite useful and fun to use. And one thing that we see that we plan to have as quite a big part of the game is rewarding exploration. And the best way to reward exploration is to hide stuff throughout the map and let people explore and find and have them have a monetary value to doing so. So the idea here is that for in like a player story example, maybe a Caripen driver could be renting his services to landowners to explore their lands and tell them and give them a map saying, look, in these areas you have some of these resources, in these areas you have some of these other resources. Here is some super high value uranium and stuff like that you may find. And then you basically making the reward for exploration being the commodity of information that they can then sell and trade and do as they please with. Because as players will notice right now in the game, you're not sure what resources are where until you actually mine them and get the resources and get the raw ores. At that point, you know what there was, but that means that without knowing ahead of time, you may waste a lot of time because, well, you have to mine it to know what it is.
It's actually one related question with this. With the radar on our vehicle, we'll be able to map our entire land and have it documented forever where certain ore or certain resources are located.
That's yes and no, because the objective is that we will repopulate and move around some resources on lands, not move around, but we'll repopulate them. So if you have some resources in a certain area of your land, once you mine those out, we will respawn some of them in other areas of your land. So there's always more to explore. There's always there's always more to explore. So a map of the land would eventually go completely out of date.
Right. It's
And
normal.
yeah. So
Technologies are moving forward.
well, exactly. And the how exactly the information is stored, we haven't yet decided. But in general, this is the kind of thing where I would rather not give an automated tool for. Like, there's kind of two ways we could do this. Like, one way, for example, is like uncovering the fog of war in an RTS game, which means like you just need to send a person to basically just go in a zigzag pattern across the whole land, and then you know everything. You discover the whole thing, it's all done. And then you have like some file that you can just send to people, and that's all the information. And I'm against that idea in principle because it makes exploration not about exploring the land. It makes it more just about uh, finding the most efficient zigzag pattern across the land. It's kind of boring. Whereas what I would rather do is have the information be fleeting. So as you're moving around, you're getting these heads-up display warnings for things being detected, and it's up to the explorer to parse that information, figure out what is of value, what is not, and then give them some simple tool to note that information down. For example, the ability to draw on the map. So as you're driving around, you could have the land map that's in the game right now just open maybe to the side of your screen. And as you're driving around, you see where you are. If you see a notice like potential uranium deposit, you just mark that location on the map as a potential uranium deposit. Maybe come back and scan it with far less efficient, far slower, but more precise instruments at a later point in time. This also makes the experience of exploring and gathering that information a skill of some sorts about recognizing patterns in the land, recognizing what you're looking for. Because, for example, if let's say you head out to look for uranium, you may be ignoring iron deposits, and then a week down the line, you may be like, "Oh, we need some iron deposits," and someone who approached the exploration passionately may still remember those moments, like where they spotted stuff, or someone who was very diligent with their note taking, etc. And so it makes it more of a engaging process. There's more room for failure, which means there's more room for success.
So I can smell some sort of specialisms here. So the way you describe, some people can be like really develop a specialism in exploring resources and be, as you said, like very meticulous and precise about that. So they can make for living out of that. Same probably applies for the next sort of profession or specialism. I would say the mining. As you mentioned, again, you may need additional sort of more accurate equipment to get to certain places. So, guys, just keep on listening, because I believe Nick throws some really interesting hints on what can be and what will be done. Nick, shall we go back to the blueprints, to blueprints, and explain for the crowds further about vehicles? So we talked about suspension part. We briefly mentioned We briefly mentioned the
There's
GPR.
I think one final note on the suspension. You'll notice this vehicle has two different suspension systems. And that's because if you look at the design of the vehicle, obviously a lot of the weight in that radar dome is concentrated at the rear of the vehicle. So the front two wheels are suspended via an arm, which gives a lot more range of travel, easier for climbing up and down curves, whereas the rear suspension has a bit less travel. However, it's able to support a lot more mass, which is why it's designed as such, and also why you have two wheels in a conjoined suspension cradle. I'm not sure what the right word would be.
Cradle. Yeah.
I guess. And that's designed with a different suspension system to the front. Because, as we said, we kind of approach this as if we were designing a real vehicle that had to work. And what we found is that you can't just, if you use the same style of suspension in the rear to the front, then you just wouldn't have enough travel at the front of the vehicle to be able to climb up and down rocks, hills, and stuff like that. And if we mirrored the front suspension in the rear, it would be too off balance. You wouldn't be able, like, it would be constantly stressed supporting the mass. And if you moved the suspension arms pivot points further back, then the center of not gravity, center of
Weight, balance.
yes, the center of balance is center of gravity. There's center of gravity, and then there's like center of torque, rotational motion. Like if you apply a force at either end, the point where it'll actually rotate around in a vacuum, that becomes too far forwards, and it makes the vehicle quite unstable, especially at higher speeds and stuff like that. So that's how we ended up coming to this suspension arrangement.
Okay. So active suspension. Yeah.
So now, getting into some of the other elements of the vehicles, this vehicle can only support a single occupant, just the driver, as the rest of that the vehicle's hull is taken up by the radar dome and, most importantly, cooling systems for the radar dome itself. Because people know Mars is cold, but one thing that a lot of people don't take into consideration is that because there's so much less air pressure, it means it's actually a lot harder to cool things down, because we don't have convection cooling is just 90% less effective there, because there is 90% less air moving over the surfaces. So the same problem you have in space of like the the International Space Station or satellites and stuff, the only way they can radiate heat is through, the only way they can get rid of heat is through radiation, which is fairly slow process. On Mars, we can still use convection, like surface area, blowing air past a cooling fin grid or something like that. But because the air is so much less dense, it's not nearly as effective. So cooling of machines that constantly generate heat becomes kind of a big problem, which is why you see here we have cooling panels at the back and then also air intakes at the front, which intake air, compress it, and then pass it over cooling fins to once again help maintain a lower cooling temperature.
Right.
And although it is only one occupant, the vehicle does have full life support systems for said occupant. So you don't, in fact, it has very good ones. As an exploration vehicle, it's designed to be able to go into very cold environments, high radiation environments, and so forth. So the shielding, heating systems, oxygen reservoirs are very well. The first two are very well developed. The second one is very large, or the third one is very large, so that you can be taking this on extended expeditions across the Martian surface and not need to worry about dying as much as you would in another vehicle.
Nick, there's actually a related question from the community. So, of course, everyone expects, that they can explore the remote areas. As you said, that's a vehicle fit for one purpose, one person with full supply systems. But how much of additional stuff the guys will be able to take on those exploration journeys?
So this vehicle, as I mentioned before, it gives up a lot of its hull space to the sensor array and life support systems and fuel uh, energy reservoirs to be able to achieve all of its goals as a scout. So although it does have some inventory capacity, it's quite minimal. So it wouldn't be very useful as a transportation vehicle of massive amounts of ore. Now, that said, if you're going out and you're mining something that is quite in quite rare supply, for example, lithium, which is quite rare, quite high value, this would be probably all that you would need if you're thinking of just a solo player going out exploring and mining for lithium. You'd be far better off using this than, say, a resource transportation vehicle, because the challenges there are in finding it, and once you do, you don't have much quantity of it. So the storage space on this vehicle would be sufficient for that. But something like mining anything in quantity, or mining irons or clays or ice, anything like that, it would be far more useful than doing it on foot, but it's far from optimal. That's
Mhm.
where some of our other vehicles that we'll be launching later will be coming in.
Probably, like if we're going here more technical, do we have an idea sort of the carrying capacity of each vehicle to be defined in liters, cubic meters, cubic centimeters?
It'll be defined mostly in mass. That's how we deal with most of our uh, limitations, is
Hmm.
done in mass. Because most objects that are less massive can be compressed. So at the end of the day, the limiting factor often is mass. And that same thing like with the colonist, uh, as everyone has known. Like I think the colonist can hold, I believe it's 500 kilograms before becoming completely overburdened and struggling to move and walk. Uh, or 500 kilograms as in kilograms as a unit of mass, not weight, meaning that realistically they're carrying about like 160 kilograms on their back, which is a lot, but we assume the colonists are decently fit and have a bit of exosuits
Hmm.
enhancement to help them carry the weight. So in vehicles, that's how the limitations on inventory will be decided. The exact amount that this vehicle can carry hasn't been decided yet. That's something we want to get player feedback on and play testing on. That's like why we're at this stage of development where we're getting features in and working and giving them to the community as fast as possible, because uh, afterwards it's a lot harder to balance these things or change these things once people are actively using them to earn a living. And then you also have problems of uh, uh, biases. It's a lot easier to be unbiased and give real feedback while we're all testing and trying to find the most fun and enjoyable game mechanics now. Whereas in the future, when you're asking someone who have made it their job to, for example, be an explorer, then now there is a monetary motivation in the opinions and feedback that they give. So it's kind of it's everyone wants the same thing. We all want the game to be as enjoyable as possible, because if it's fun, more people will play it. If more people are playing it, then everyone has a larger market to sell to. That's how we all succeed if the more people are playing the game. So right now, at this earlier stages of development, it's a lot easier for everyone to give more honest and objective feedback on what is and is not fun.